Hello everybody! Today we'll be doing chapter 7 of Athol Fugard's Tsotsi. Tsotsi afterwards realized one thing about that night. His mistake was that he let the cripple reach Main Street. He should have taken him after he left Terminal Place. There had been enough time and chances. What was more, he would have had the advantage of complete surprise, because the cripple hadn't realized he was being followed until almost at the end of the deserted street. But instead, and for a reason he could only guess at in terms of what happened later in the night, Tsotsi let him escape into the safety of the bright lights and big crowds. Allowing that to happen was, in its way, like blue gum trees. It led to a lot. Their actual meeting came as a moment of sudden terror. It was purely by accident that Tsotsi stepped on the hand. It was an even purer coincidence that just before it happened he had started thinking yet again about the baby, the blue gums, and the bitch. So compelling and exclusive was the power of this mystery that momentarily he had forgotten about Butcher and Diop, and where he was and why he was there. By agreement, the three of them had wandered off separately into the crowds with their eyes and ears open. Tsotsi was asking himself again why it was that the bitch crawled so far and no further, always almost reaching him, but not quite. And what was the meaning of the dumb fear inside himself when he saw her? Coming at that moment, the oath, "Whelp of a yellow bitch," had torn into his thoughts, stampeding them into a split second of chaos and terror. When, almost simultaneously with his oath, Morris Shabalala had pushed away the offending foot, it had felt to Tsotsi as if the bitch had at last reached him and was at his legs with her yellow teeth. The moment passed in a blink. When he looked down at the pavement, his thoughts fled and his terror lingered in his heart, in only as the troubled echo of its passing. His mind would have been a blank were it not for the burning hate of the cripple at his feet. It turned so violently in his guts, he almost kicked him. He remembered in time that he was in Terminal Place, and that the crowds were big enough to be brave with a man who kicked a beggar. But he remembered also the hour and his purpose. What happened next was as natural as the pattern of his life, as walking and sleeping were in those of other men. "I'll take you, you bastard," he thought. "Tonight I'll take you." His choice was made, in terms of hard economics, of profit of the job measured against the likely loss of a life. The choice was indifferent. Those beggar boys never made it that much that was worth following one away when you could have just easily piled your gang into a taxi and taken your chance at the driver somewhere along the road back to the township. They were much more the game of those younger years when you got tired of snatching in shops and were beginning to think of bolder and bigger schemes. But it was typical of Tsotsi to act at times in disregard of the hard and fast rules by which those like himself had learned to live. It was this perverse streak in his nature that made him pick one specially for Boston the previous evening, and had now chosen one for itself. It was his ugliness, the slow, creeping deformity of the man that kept Tsotsi faithfully behind his back. He studied him with fascination. In the crowds of Terminal Place, he was able to follow unobserved and yet close enough to hear the swinish grunt the cripple made after every reach of his long arms. He caught snatches of the lunatic conversation he kept up with himself. Once he was so near that looking down he saw, with 3 deep creases, had only been groined into the neck by the repeated effort of forcing the head back so as to see ahead. The beggar had to do just this from time to time, and Tsotsi noticed that the skin folded and bulged out like the ropes of a double-stranded noose. And then he looked like a dog who had been pulled up short by a savage jerk of its leash. His hands were the same lifeless grey of the pavements. Their nails were almost bluish black. When the man crawled out of Terminal Place, Tsotsi was forced to drop back in case he became suspicious. This did nothing to dampen his morbid interest. If anything, it increased it, because from the perspective of a few yards he noticed details that he had missed before. At that distance, he could see the first budding of the hump he would one day carry around like a mountain on his back, if he lived long enough. There was also the timing about his movement. It was all in the arms. From the shoulders down, he might just as well have been a sack of potatoes, because he dragged himself like that. In this he reminded Tsotsi of something. At first he couldn't think of what it was, and when he did remember, he was excited. He moved like the bitch of his memory. It was a comparison that worked both ways, because it also revealed something about the bitch that he had not realized. Her back legs had been useless, too. She had used only the front ones, like him. After this discovery, Tsotsi's interest in his victim rose to an obsessive intensity, and he let his time and opportunities slip away. This man, this half-man, this unsightly and disfigured remnant of a man, Tsotsi recognized, with all the certainty of his unnumbered years, as being the true figuration of life. He was a symbol of this precisely because he was bent and broken, and so without meaning that other men had abandoned him. This was the final reality to life. Everything else was just rouge and lipstick on an ugly face. Smiles and laughter changed nothing. No more than a new pair of trousers would have given back the cripple his legs. Tsotsi was convinced of this. The conviction was so absolute it was part of himself, of his life and of his way of living. It was there like the blood in his veins and his heartbeat. Where it had come from, he did not know, but he had it. He had a deeply intimate and personal knowledge of the grotesque anatomy of life. He had never seen it so clearly, though. In the past it had come like a bad aftertaste to those moments when unavoidably he had been brought to the man and his prisoner, the one who recognized Tsotsi and called him David. For days afterwards, Tsotsi had brooded and wasn't upon the man who had cried, "It's me, Peter." He had known it was better to forget him, and had promptly done so. Tsotsi brooded because when he had finished that dice game with Butcher and Diab, and the man's hopeless cries were heard no more, he had kept on forgetting it. The world was an ugly place. It was the ugliness of things that had gone crooked and were now twisted out of all meaning. It was a deformity that began with houses that had been badly matched to the bodies they held, being too small, or too windy, or cracked open to the rain like the careless lying of an egg on sharp rocks. Then there were the bodies themselves. In the cruel confinements of their lives they had grown awry. The very effort of living was a pain. You could hear it in your bed at night if your ears had been sharpened enough by disgust. The world was one long wheeze and rattle as it laboured uncertain in sleep. Butcher's hands were another living embodiment of this reality. So too was the dead face of Gumboot Dalmini, the one they had taken on the trains. It was true of all life. The only trees in the township, those around the cemetery, had expressed it in their stunted growth, drawing out the full meaning of their misshapen silhouettes seen against the windy sky. It amounted to the basic horror of existence. There were days, of course, long, unconscious stretches of time when he didn't realize it, or had forgotten it in the way men lose their deepest convictions, or the morals of their daily lives. Then, when something else happened that nearly got him remembering, like the time he watched the spider spin its web, or even when he smelt damp newspapers, it was back again, and his eyes, as if given the miracle of real sight, saw the truth. But never had the experience been so intense, so focused at that twilight time when he walked out of Terminal Place. Ahead of him crawled the truth as he had never seen it before, rolled up, convoluted, twisted into itself in one human parcel called Morris Shabalala. It was not long before Tsotsi realized that he had made a big mistake in letting the cripple reach Main Street. He'd known all along, of course, that once it happened he would have to wait for another dark and deserted spot before he could make his money. But he thought it would only be a question of following this man and being ready when the right moment came, when he discovered that something else had got involved. It happened when Morris Shabalala rested at the corner where the man was selling newspapers. Tsotsi saw him look back, straining for a sight of his pursuer, and something of his brief when he thought he had shaken him off. With even greater clarity he saw his fear a few minutes later when he spotted Tsotsi on the opposite side of the street. It was the moment, and what happened was a feeling. It was totally unlike the hate he had felt when he first saw him in Terminal Place. It was also not the disgust that had welled up so strongly when he followed him. It was nothing he seemed to know, and yet could not say he had felt before. And it had come when he saw the other man's fear. It came again when Morris Shabalala dropped down and dragged off. It came yet again when he saw how much faster the cripple was trying to move, as if what lay ahead was better than what he had left behind. It occurred more frequently as time passed, so that a few blocks down the feeling was coming as measured as his heartbeat. Tsotsi knew that something was happening to him, but when he discovered the real nature of the feeling, it had gone so far it was too late to do anything about it. They had stopped again. It was obvious why. But maybe, even if that dark little side street hadn't been there, he would still have stopped, because he needed the rest. He looked even more like a dog when he was out of breath. His body had the same rhythmic up and down movement as when it panted. At that distance, Tsotsi was still on the opposite side. The light sometimes played tricks on his eyes, and he imagined he saw a long tongue rolling out of the bent head. When he looked up, either to see down the side street or at Tsotsi across the road, or back over his shoulder, you thought he was going to howl, the way dogs did in the townships, sitting on their haunches in the empty streets when the moon was bright. One short and dark side street, and the cripple too frightened to crawl into it. He was right, of course. Tsotsi knew that, if the cripple moved down it, the time would have come to act. While he watched the cripple and waited, Tsotsi kept saying to himself, "I don't know you, fucker. Not from nowhere. So what do I care? Just you make a move. I don't care a damn thing for you." It would never have been necessary to say this to himself before. He had to now, and it was because of the feeling. Tsotsi had a growing presentiment of its nature, but it was nothing not yet fully revealed. At that moment he still knew it only by its hidden working in his body. It was there that the lethargy of his legs that should have been stiff and ready to run when the moment came, as a tiredness in his fingers that would have to be even quicker as if he forced to use a knife. Above all else, it was there as a desire, and even that in its way was dull and only half-formed. That it would be better if the cripple didn't move, if neither of them moved at all, and all of the time to come rushed past like the motor cars, leaving him against the wall and the cripple on his corner. The full truth of what had happened to him came when the old car stalled and was pushed to the corner, and he saw his man escape in its wake. He did care. Regardless of what he had been saying to himself a few minutes ago, he did care. There was no possibility of doubt or of arguing it away. When Morris Shabalala crawled off behind the car, Tsotsi experienced a spasm of relief. He didn't believe it of himself. He shook his head the way donkeys do to dislodge the troublesome swarm of flies. He cleared his throat and spat onto the pavement, as if there were a galling taste in his mouth. He even closed his eyes and dropped his head back against the wall, as if he had escaped into a few more hours of troubled living, and he was desperately glad. It was obvious now what had been happening to him as he followed Morris Shabalala down the street. He was also right in thinking it had never happened before. He had felt for his victim. Tsotsi kept well back after that, and from the darkness of a doorway he watched the cripple enter the Bantu eating house. There was an Indian shop opposite it, and beside the shop a soap-smelling alleyway with 3 dustbins at the entrance. They were so crammed with garbage, the lids didn't fit. Tsotsi brought a few slices of polony from the shop, then sat down on one of the dustbins to wait some more, but above all to examine the strange experience of feeling for a man. He refined the thought. The truth of the matter was not his feelings, but the other man's. It was Morris Shabalala's fear, his desperation, the agony of his futile effort to escape, his gladness when the inevitable had been deferred for a little while longer. But how had it happened that he, Tsotsi, who had gone so much more to so many others, had had to wait until that night before realizing something of what the other man felt? He could only guess at the answers. Groping blindly, his thoughts at times brushed the truth, as when suddenly and irrationally it seemed. He remembered Boston being sick after the job on the trains. He felt there was a connection between this new experience of his and that moment of Boston's. But all the full meaning and miracle of sharing in the other man's suffering eluded his stumbling attempts to catch it. In retrospect, there was only the long, painful, silent pursuit down the main street, and how somewhere in the course of it was the ceaseless magnification of his focus, of his interest in the cripple had found a crack and a way into the experience of his flesh. That was what it was. The experience of Morris Shabalala's flesh. What is sympathy? If you had asked Tsotsi this, telling him that it was his new experience, he would have answered, like light, meaning that it revealed. Pressed further, he might have thought of darkness, and lighting a candle, and holding it up to find Morris Shabalala within the halo of its radiance. He was seeing him for the first time, in a way that he hadn't seen him before, or with a second sort of sight, or maybe more clearly. The subtleties did not matter. What was important was that in the light of his sympathy, the cripple was revealed. But it wasn't all. The same light fell on the baby, and somehow on Boston too, and wasn't that last face of Gumboot Dalmini there, almost where the light ended and things weren't so clear anymore. And beyond that, still what? A sense of space, of an infinity stretching away so vast that the whole world, the crooked trees, the township streets, the crowded, the wheezing rooms, might have been waiting there for a brighter, intense revelation. After only one bite of the polony fell unnoticed from his hands, feeling as if he had drunk too much, Tsotsi lurched to his feet and around to the front of the shop. He wanted to see himself. He was sure he looked different, that he would see on his person some sign of the past few hours. A new head, maybe, with other eyes and strange lips speaking in different words. There were none of the mirrors that some of the big shops had in Main Street, but a little way down he caught the ghost of his reflection in the display window of a shoe store. The light of the pavement was too dim for it to be clear. When he moved up to the glass, his image disappeared. He could only see it standing well back, and at that distance and dimness he recognized nothing except the shape of a man. It could be me, he thought, or Boston, or Butcher, or even the beggar if he had legs. There was a comfort in this thought. The door to the Bantu eating house was being bolted and locked. A second later the lights went out, almost in panic. Tsotsi looked around the street. I've lost him, he thought. He's got away. He ran very quickly back the way he had come. There was no sign of the cripple. At the street, where the cripple had escaped behind the car, Tsotsi stopped. Why have I come back? Maybe he's gone forward. He was out of breath, but ran back even quicker than the Bunty eating house and then beyond it. When he saw him, his relief escaped in a small, hysterical laugh. My man, I nearly lost you. I have found you back. My poor slow man, I am sorry. I'll tell you I'm sorry, my poor slow man, but what can I do? There was nothing he could do but drop back again into the shadows and follow, waiting for the right moment. It was inevitable, like sunrise, or sunset. You chose a man and you kept after him until it was over. His new-found sympathy regretted this. It pained him to see the tired and slow way the beggar moved, thinking that he was at last safe. But what could Tsotsi do? He had chosen, and this was his man. With each passing step, each passing drag nearer their appointed meeting, his sympathy cut deeper until the time came when it felt as if his feet and his heart were pointing in opposite directions, and that one way was forward, all for all of him. There was no conflict. It wasn't a question of should I or shouldn't I. That didn't exist. He was resigned to the inevitable, watching it unfold as doctors would the last stages of a disease in a patient who is beyond help. Tsotsi waited with painful anticipation for the moment when Morris Shabalala would realize again that he was being followed. It seemed it would never come, either because he was tired, or not caring, or feeling completely safe. The cripple did not look back once. It reached a point where Tsotsi could no longer stand the strain. He made noises, he coughed, he whistled, and when Morris Shabalala started crawling past the loading bays, Tsotsi came the closest he had been since Terminal Place. At last it happened, and from that moment, the cripple looking back white-eyed as Tsotsi had, who paused under a lamp, the last minutes before their meeting exploded as violently as the preceding hours, had been slow. Slow in their torture and accumulation of terror. First the money, piled by the cripple into a careful heap in the light. This was the justification of everything, of the choice on the crowded pavement of Terminal Place, of a torture that had broken a man's spirit more surely than his body had been halved by the falling beam in the chaos of a mineshaft, of useless sympathy, burning now like a small candle where darkness would have been better, and Morris Shabalala had put it down, the lustrous heap of it, as if, like a full stop in the middle of the night, it would end the rhythm of Tsotsi's feet and cancel what was yet to come. It was cheap. Death would have been a bargain at that price, and now it was trying to buy life. A sense of outrage at its belittlement of all that had happened gripped Tsotsi. He kicked it, flying into the night, and it was not just for his own sake, but for the other man's as well, as if in retribution for this action. The stones came hurtling at him, making him skip and dance like a puppet strung from an epileptic hand. Tsotsi wanted to call out, "I understand, my poor slow man, I understand." But he was forced into the darkness where the obscenities came flying at him with much violence. They were broken only by the sobs, and even though they were not meant for him, they were the most terrible of all when his voice cracked. Tsotsi had circled and was waiting in front, squatting in a cement platform, in the final darkness beyond the last lamppost. He waited until the cripple stopped a few feet away. Then he waited for silence, and after the sobbing and strangled breaths had quietened, he waited to be seen. Their meeting was wordless. They didn't need them. Into a few silent seconds, they crowded the intimacy of a lifetime, and so that when Tsotsi eventually did speak, it was as if they had known each other forever. "What do you feel?" "Nothing." His voice was hoarse, the words rushing like wind through a leafless tree, dead from drought. Nothing? It is over. Feeling is over. What did you feel? A fear of death. No more? No more. Morris Shabalala leaned back against the lamp. It was the position of his poverty, of the long, empty hours on a street corner while he waited for pennies to fall. But with this difference. He looked up, resting his head against the wall, and not just because he was tired. No more. It is the lesson of my hands. I have this night learnt it in my heart. Tell me, Tsotsi asked. My hands held life. Tsotsi waited. My hands felt it. Ow! I picked nipples like berries, and the women cried with happiness when they moved to their secret parts. Then came. He searched forward. Speak, man, Tsotsi asked when the pause had yawned out into seconds and then minutes. The sky fell down, the world turned upside down for me, and I walked through life on my hands. You have seen enough. These hands no longer feel. Now my heart no longer feels. Tonight my manhood fell down and crawled beside me and felt fear, and felt it so much it no longer feels it. You have seen, you have heard a big man cry. It is enough. It was the worst of all, Tsotsi said. Of all the things since we began, the crying was the worst. What else was there? You grunt. When you crawl, you grunt like a dog thing. What else? You look like a dog man, and I feel with you. But now I want to know, how do you piss? Sitting up between my stumps. Shit. Bending forward as if I am going to crawl. Women? Never. They laugh. What do you know, man? What do you know this night? You took a long time. You are patient. I tell you I felt for you, man. If I had my legs and my sticks, I would have killed you. In a short time, I would have cracked your head open like a nut. Bantu boy, hey, me, I use a knife. Now me, what have I done to you? I gave you my money, all my money from one day. I have nothing else. I don't want the money. I kicked it. I saw. I tell you, man, I did feel. Then why did you choose me, Tsotsi? You are ugly, beggar. You are the ugliest thing I ever did see. Morris Shabalala heard this without anger. It was the truth. There had been more bitter things in his life. Is that all? Morris Shabalala thought about the question unhurriedly. Was it all? No. There was still something else, and in its way it was the greatest of all. It was his revelation, but how did you touch something like that, or pick it up in words so that you can say it and hear it? There was a simple statement of it, but he hesitated, uncertain that 4 common words could mean so much. I want to live, he said at last. Tsotsi thought he understood. I want to live, Morris Shabalala repeated. You know that. Yes, Tsotsi said. No, you don't, the cripple said, and for the first time in their talk his voice rang with emotion. How could he know it? How could anyone know the full meaning from only 4 words? There was something like a lifetime clamouring behind those words. What else were the years he had spent crawling along the unending miles of the city pavements? Hadn't it begun with a moment as terrifying as that other birth from a woman's belly? Hadn't they dragged him out of an even darker womb to begin a sequence of days so different, so unlike anything he had ever known before, that it could only be likened to being born again? Time was relative, measured by something be like other than days and months. His 6 years had made him an old man. No, you don't, he said to Tsotsi, his voice quick and agitated at the rejection of so much of him. It's not just you and your knife. I say it to myself, not you, to my hard hands and my ugly face and my no legs. I say it after many years of thinking I was dead and tomorrow was nothing except maybe the day when the rest of me would be buried with the other pieces. Morris Shabalala saw it very clearly now. He was seeing it passionately, the truth. After all the years of thinking, nothing mattered. What is it? What do you mean, man? Tsotsi could see the man's excitement. The cripple was sitting forward now, holding out both his hands as if to feel the rain or receive a tremendous gift. But they were trembling, and the sight of them excited Tsotsi. What do you mean, man? I don't know a damned thing what you're saying. Sunshine, he said. Sunshine and stones, the warm stones on the street. I felt it tonight. At the end of the day, I must feel it tomorrow. If my hands don't feel, I'll make a hole in my trousers and sit with my soft bum to feel, or lay my face on the ground. There is also... What is there also? Tsotsi asked. He was also trembling now with excitement. He didn't understand the outward meaning of the words. He didn't need to. Their intimacy at that moment was of so fine a nature that the excitement, the wonder of the cripple broke through the personal context of his words and touched Tsotsi. Rain falling down and wind blowing, the trees growing and the colours of things, and the streets where I have heard birds sing. Do you understand now? I want to live. Do you understand? Yes, man. I am telling you all the time I am feeling with you. Why do you have to kill me, Tsotsi? Tsotsi took an eternity to reply, or so it seemed to the man beneath him. And even when he did speak, the pauses between the words were so long. It seemed man could be born and live and die in them. I don't have to. This meant nothing to Morris Shabalala until the young man said it again. I don't have to. Then Tsotsi stood up, and with something like a laugh he walked a little distance away, where he stood for a long time with his hands on his hips. Tsotsi did not go back to his perch on the wall, but like the other man sat down with his back to it, at a distance away in the darkness. He said it for the third time. I don't have to. It is over, beggar. I let you live. How old are you, Tsotsi? Morris Shabalala asked. I don't know, he replied truthfully, but I will find out. Morris Shabalala tried hard to see him, but because of the darkness there was only the shape of the man. He tried to remember what he had seen of him in the streets where there had been light, but all he could picture was his own terror. I must give him something, he thought. I must give this strange and terrible night something back for all it has given me. With all the instinct of his kind, he turned to beauty and gave back the most beautiful thing he knew. Mothers love their children, I know, and I remember. They sing us songs when we are small. I am telling you, Tsotsi. Mothers do love their children. After this there was a silence, for the words to register and make their meaning, for Tsotsi to stand up and say in reply, they don't. I'm telling you, I know they don't. And then he walked away. He looked back. The cripple had crawled away to the lamp-post, where the money was scattered, and he was picking up what he could find. The city is dead. With the life of its pavements drained away, and the straight, unplanked lines of the city lay exposed. The street lamps stick up like golden-headed pins holding it to the earth. They are the only light now, because now the shop windows are dark. At the taxi ranks, the night drivers are slumped over their wheels and sleep. Tsotsi passes them because they are only take whites. He also passes night watchmen, sitting on the boxes in the doorways, wrapped up in old army coats and armed with knobbed kiris, like brooding angels who have executed judgment. Soon Tsotsi is completely alone, and then when he moves like the last small impulse of a dead body. It was a long walk back to the township, but Tsotsi stopped only once on the way. Even then he had to try several times before finally succeeding, because he wanted to stop. He needed to think, but each time he sat down, once on the closed-in seat of a white bus stop, a mile later beside the fence of a lumber yard, and then after that just on the pavement of a dark street. Each time he lost control of his thinking. Like a driverless car down a steep hill, his mind moved like a gathering momentum past images and incidents until they were racing past so fast he didn't have time to recognize their meaning. They came without any sensible sequence. A shoebox, Boston drawing a thin line of blood across his arm with the knife, the mummified face of the baby blooming out into the black hole as it cried, then the bitch, then the beggar pissing between his stumps, then an Indian shopkeeper saying, "Very good, baby milk." The inward acceleration of his thinking was terrifying. He seemed incapable of holding on to one thought long enough to avert the next one. Walking helped because it stopped him thinking. He hung determinedly on to every physical sensation involved in picking up one foot and placing it in front of the other. He concentrated on the vague feelings he had of the pavement through the soles of his tackies. He studied the swinging rhythm of his arms and noticed that they were synchronized with that of his feet. But when he stopped again, the same thing happened. At first, he would actually have to search for something to think about, as if his mind had stalled just over the top of the precipitous line. What was there? He would ask himself. What is there to think about? This question was the push that brought him to the edge. The baby, he would say, and then he was on his way down. The baby. Now. Okay. And Boston. Yes. Okay now. And the bitch too. The blue gums, the shoebox, the beggar. And by then it was happening again, and he would jump to his feet with a pounding heart and walk away. Once he had turned his back on the centre of the city, his way lay through an extensive factory area, where Tsotsi made his third unsuccessful attempt to stop and think. It was a world which must have had its own model, the plaything precision of a child's blocks. The streets, cross-laid in the flauntless squaring of a grill, were completely untenanted. Only once did he see a sign of life, when a car appeared at an intersection ahead of him. It nosed its way uncertainly across the street as if it had wandered in by accident and got lost. At each corner, Tsotsi passed. He looked briefly, if at all, down another bank of vacant walls, the black squares of double doors, the side entrances, high barred windows checkered the night with another variant of the severe pattern, the secret lamps, spaced at unvarying intervals along the edges of the pavements, added a final strict rhythm to the monotony of the night with the movement of his shadow, beside him, then ahead, then behind, passing in a strange, unaging metamorphosis from an almost jet black to a greying insubstantiality that finally seeped away into the bricks, only to reappear later behind him and repeat the cycle. If Tsotsi had had eyes for such things, he would have seen in the world around him an enormous model of an inward maze of his images, a world seemingly without beginning or end. It was not just by chance that he finally achieved his purpose and found his moment to think in something like peace only when he emerged out of this labyrinth. More than anything else, the effect of turning that last corner was a sensation of space, a tremendous lift and room to breathe again, as if a silent detonation that moment had blasted apart the ingrown complexities in the city. The road he had turned into was broad, and on one side dropped steeply into an expanse of uncrowded earth that cut deeply through the city, like a dry course of a mighty summer thunder torrent. This was the principal railway artery of the city, and at the point where Tsotsi stood it had begun its gradual lift out of the earth before fanning out its innumerable pairs of parallel tracks to every corner of the country. The city was strung out on the opposite side of a toothed silhouette that at the most stole a few paltry inches from the generous curve of sky overhead. A 3/4 moon had risen clear of the ragged building line and was shining with intense purity. It was at the moon that Tsotsi looked for the few minutes he paused the corner. With his first sight of it, and the surprise of seeing it so unexpectedly, it came one thought. Its effect was a serenity as calm and cold as the moonlight itself. It was the same moon of last night. Last night, the blue gum trees were last night. A little way further, the road skirted extensive marshalling yards. Tsotsi hurried down, eager to sit there and think. Beyond a heavy metal fence was a stretch of weedy grass. He would be safe there from prowling police cars. It was a scene of melancholic and intermittent activity, as if the remnants of a herd of primeval armor-plated beasts were crawled there, and their brute force trained into man's service. They filled the night with the stunt and snort of their labour, the ceaseless coupling and uncoupling of coaches, the jolting, jarring moments when engines hooked up, rang out in hard metallic noise. A few of the big locos, black and steaming with sweat it seemed, stood massively still under the tall flood lamps. They whistled from time to time, mostly in a flat, whispery note, like the penny flutes of the township streets, but occasionally a whistle would scream out that was all sound, a clean, ululating, endless vowel. Among them, moving like a nonchalant shepherd's, strolled lonely men with lanterns swinging in their hands. Tsotsi took in the picture with one sweeping gaze. But it was at the moon when he again looked longest. 24 hours. Only one day had passed since his rest in the grove of blue gum trees. It was a thought that reduced to a tangible dimension the unexpected turning in his life. It made it possible for him to put everything in its place. He could start at the beginning and work his way through the strange sequence of events that were strung out like unmatched beads between his two midnight meetings, first with the woman and then with the bigger. Looking back, it felt as if he had woken up to a day of another man's life. There had been no precedents in his days for feeding a baby or sparing a man's life, but now the experience of it had become his, an indelible part of his being, as he sat there on the bank of stubbled grass, under the moon, with engines grunting at his feet. It was his baby now, by the law of finders keepers, hidden away in a ruin. It had certainly been his half-memory of the bitch, his full sympathy for the beggar. So what now? Was it the end? Had it been nothing more than a freak out-of-season storm in the dry climate of his life? Did he go back to his old pattern tomorrow and forget today, and wait in his room for Butcher and Diop and maybe Boston? Yes, Boston. What the hell about Boston? And together with them, plan another job. Tsotsi knew that moment that there was no turning back on that day, and what had happened happened. He had a presentiment. It was only the beginning of something, that a lot more was to come. It wasn't what that he knew, or thought he knew, what would happen next. But that one day had left him with an awareness of the strange and sudden turnings that life would take. There might be more ahead. There was still the baby, and tomorrow would be clamouring for his attention. He would feed it when he got back to the township and it was light. There was still the bitch. More than ever before, he wanted to find the other pieces that went with that fragment of a memory. There was still his sympathy and the awesome discovery. The monument when the cripple had asked, "Why do you have to kill me?" That it was for him, Tsotsi, to choose between life and death. What he had thought was inevitable turned out to be wholly dependent upon him and his choice. This, more than anything else, was a thought that seemed to reach down deep and touch the hidden meaning of a past 24 hours. Tsotsi had always thought about life as a straight line, as undeviating as the one he had taken earlier in the evening in following the beggar from Terminal Place, as inflexible as the railway tracks that swept past him, leaving no choice but to be carried where they went. And because Tsotsi had no memories, and had collected none, there wasn't even the metaphorical going backward in time to something already past. There had only been the present. That one continuous moment carrying him forward without questions or regrets of his part. Now it seemed he was wrong. One day had shaken the whole basis of his life. There were alternatives in life. He'd had an inkling of this early in the afternoon with Butcher and Diop in his room and his inability to choose their job for that night. What he had since learned was that the alternatives were even greater than he had imagined. It was not just the sort of job, a choice of the ways and victims, killing itself as a choice. A question shot with the impact of a bullet into his mind. When had he made that choice? Trembling with a confusion of anger and excitement, he stood up and looked round desperately. When and how he made the choice in the first place. Then, as if he had stood up only to take the full weight of the past day on his shoulders, his knees buckled and he sank back into the ground. It was more than he could carry. The outburst of emotion ebbed away, and with it, the last reserves of his strength. He curled up on the ground and slept. An engine whistle blew out like a white ribbon in the wind.